This must be the most iconic view in the whole of Australia. The iconic Opera House, the iconic Harbour Bridge, the iconic harbour itself. Enough of all the iconics. Come down here a minute. We've all seen this view about 1 million times before. We don't want to keep staring at it like a bunch of lunatics. I'm going to take you on a walk somewhere slightly different. Trust me, it'll be great. I'm walking all around Australia. Today it's Sydney, and I'm hitting the streets of its oldest suburb, Woolloomooloo. I'll untangle the secret of the Australian crawl. You're lost. Relive a pioneering balloon ride from the 1880s, and have words with some eccentric champions of free speech.
Stupid, ignorant people.
My adrenaline's really up. First things first, though. I don't go any place unless I can spell it. W-O-O-L-L-O-M-O-O-L-O. Do you know what that is?
No.
You weren't even listening, were you? It's not a very good start, is it? Before we head down to Woolloomooloo, which is, of course, where we're going, I want to show you this intriguing seat. It's called Mrs. Macquarie's Chair, and it's on Mrs. Macquarie's Point, which you get to along Mrs. Macquarie's Road. Have you noticed a theme emerging here? That is because in the year 1810, a bloke called Lachlan Macquarie became the governor of New South Wales, and he tried to lord it over everybody, and they really got in his case, and both he and his wife got very miserable. In fact, he tried to resign 3 times before his resignation was ultimately accepted. And I imagine her sitting here day after day, looking out to sea, thinking to herself, why, oh, why do I have to stay on this lousy continent? Why won't people let me go home? Still, it can't have been too bad. They ended up staying for 11 years. There's a pair of lorikeets up there. I think that's their nest. I know they're very common in Sydney, but they blow me away every time. One thing Australia loves more than its sporting heroes is naming something after them. This pool just up the road from Mrs. Mac's Chair is named after Andrew Boyd Charlton, a 1924 Olympic gold medalist. But we might never have heard of him if it wasn't for a bloke called Tums Cavill. Tums who? Exactly. Forbes, who were the Cavills?
They conquered the swimming world in Australia. They were the top swimmers of the time. They were the first family of Australian swimming.
And it was them who set out to show Australia and the world that this new stroke, which we now call the crawl, was better than previous strokes.
They did want to prove that you didn't have to kick the legs. You could merely trail the legs behind you and you would go faster than the current stroke, which was the side stroke at that time.
So how did the Cavills set out to prove that the crawl was so great?
They demonstrated on a race they set up. They wanted Tums Cavill to have his legs tied and to race against the orthodox side stroker. And guess who won?
Well, you will see who won right now. Right, we've got 2 volunteers here, Alan and Scott. You're starting to look a bit cold, Alan.
It's very cold.
Well, you're going to be Sid Davis,
okay.
Right? So you're the guy who did the trudgeon.
Yep.
So you put one arm...
Side strike.
Yeah, and your feet?
Scissor kick.
Exactly. Scott, you're going to be Tums Cavill. So you are the guy who's doing something nobody's ever seen around here before, the crawl. Except in order to demonstrate quite how efficient it is, Tums lashed his feet together. So if you could wrap that round your legs, well, we go off to the finishing point. Right, Forbes, how shall we start them? In the old-fashioned way?
Old-fashioned way, Tony.
All right, gentlemen. Ready, steady, go!
Getting nothing from his leg.
Here's the finishing line here. Come here. Oh. Alan,
Sorry?
You're lost. But that was quite impressive, wasn't it?
That's right, and that's what it was. It impressed the swimmers of the time. It impressed them that they had to get to the crawl stroke.
How much did he win by? Do we know?
Well, the records tell us he won easily.
Well, he certainly did today. Anyway, thank you very much for that story. That was absolutely great.
Thanks, Tony.
Now, this was the beginning of the Australian crawl rite, but a few years later, the Americans picked it up and started doing it, and guess what they called it? The American crawl. Typical. Look, come here. This is the kind of thing I love being confronted by when I'm on a walk. I've no idea who created that art installation, but half of it, the silver stuff, looks like it's some kind of monster coming out of the harbour, doesn't it? Whereas the brown stuff, that could have been something that floated away when all these industrial processes were going on at the beginning of the 20th century. So, haven't got a clue who created that. Don't know what it means, but it is pretty good, isn't it? I think art that says something about national identity is a sign of a country that's proud of its culture, don't you? We Brits are proud of ours, which is why for centuries we've been imposing it on everyone else. Robert Burns, the supreme Scottish poet. Number of times he visited Australia? 0. Number of poems he wrote about Australia? 0. Number of statues of him in Australia? 8. So, time to head for Woolloomooloo? No. I'm detouring into Sydney's Domain. Once elitist governors had stopped trying to make it their private park, it became public grounds popular with walkers, lovers, and more recently, outdoor concert goers. I'm interested in a small section called Speaker's Corner.
Atheists. I call them stupid, ignorant people.
I saw life as a series of meaningless obstacles.
You are destined to burn in hell.
It's up to you.
For more than 130 years, it's been a magnet for people with plenty to say about every subject under the sun and who don't mind playing to a crowd.
Your life is meaningless until someone comes along and gives it a meaning.
I wonder why I feel so at home.
Any questions so far?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Why do you do this? Why do you run the risk of being laughed at week after week?
If you can hold a crowd here, you can hold a crowd anywhere. But the reason I persist is because it's so much fun. I just love it.
Can I have a go?
You can have a go. Go for it.
I'm not going to be as good as you, but thank you very much. It is very easy, isn't it, to deride these men, to laugh at these men, but I tell you, they understand the crucial importance of freedom of speech. And you may say, why does that matter today? Why, when we have the internet and laptops, why does freedom of speech matter so much? Well, I will remind you, it is only 50 years ago, under the Menzies government, that people's right to speak was under threat. And it's precisely because these days are so easy that these men should hold up the torch for the right of all of us to say whatever we want, whenever we want, regardless of what we're saying. Because when things get tough, there'll be nobody around to say it at all. Thank you. Woo! Keep at it, guys. Cheers. Thank you. Nice to meet you. See you again. I really enjoyed that. My adrenaline's really up. On. Now, in order to get from the Domain to Woolloomooloo, I want you to imagine I'm a 19th century daredevil called Henri Lestrange, and that the small blue party balloon I'm blowing up is actually a giant newfangled hot air balloon. It was the year 1881. What could possibly go wrong with a hot air balloon flight? Well, quite a lot, actually. The gas that they used was coal gas, which was very flammable and also made you very giddy if you got too close to it. And as for the balloon itself, it was really heavy. So when he tried to take off, it just wouldn't budge. So what did he do? He cut the basket off the ropes and then he plaited the ropes together to form a sort of sling, and then he climbed onto the sling. But, of course, now the balloon was too light, so when they let it go, he went hurtling off towards Woolloomooloo. He was really worried now that he'd end up over the sea, so he let out some of the gas from the balloon. The problem with that, though, was that he became so dizzy with the effects of the gas that he slipped out of his hoist. So now he's just dangling from the ropes. Surely the bloke was going to die. But no, finally the balloon began to descend on Woolloomooloo. But it wasn't a gentle, nice descent. This was helter-skelter, smack down onto the houses of Palmer Street right here. And though you and I might think that was a really inglorious end, in fact, there was a huge crowd in the street and they cheered and lifted him onto their shoulders and took him, guess where to? Of course, the nearest pub for a celebration. But there's a very interesting postscript to this story. Stay there a minute. Excuse me. Can I come in for a minute? Thank you. There was a woman in the house, and when she heard all the fuss, she opened up the blinds to see what was happening. But of course, that sucked all the gas in from the balloon, which immediately ignited, blew the roof off her house, and lit up the entire area. Luckily, no one was killed, but I reckon eyebrows would have been in short supply around Palmer Street for a few months. I'm at the top end of Palmer Street now, on the corner of Burton Street, and it was here that a lot of people reckon a little miracle took place. There was this guy called Arthur Stace, and he was an alcoholic and a meth drinker, and he was a jailbird, and he was in this church, the Burton Street Tabernacle, and he heard the preacher say, "I wish that I could say the name eternity on every street in Sydney." And Stace came out and he thought, well, I could do better than that. And he dropped to his knees and he started to write the word eternity. What is so extraordinary about this is that up to that moment, he had been almost completely illiterate. He couldn't have spelt the word eternity, let alone wrote it. But after this, in magnificent copperplate, much better than the rubbish that I'm doing, he continued to write the word eternity throughout the streets of Sydney. And by the time he died, they reckon that he'd written it over 500,000 times. Decades later, Stacey's simple message was broadcast to the nation during Sydney's Millennium Fireworks display. He'd have needed a lot of chalk to write one that big. There are two things I know about Australian history. One, there's much more of it than most people think, and two, sooner or later, you'll have to go into a pub to find out about it. It's not easy being a dedicated seeker of the truth, you know. Larry, of all the dodgy pubs around here, this must have been the most notorious, wasn't it?
It certainly was. It was the dodgiest pub in the area.
It's hard to imagine that now, isn't it? It's really quite nice.
It is. Back in the day, in 1927, 1932, the period of the razor gangs, it was frequented by gangsters, various lowlifes. It's in the middle of the Depression, by the way, so it was an absolute bloodhouse.
Why was it like this? I mean, a few years previously, Woolloomooloo had been quite a posh area, hadn't it?
In the early years of the 20th century, when the transport grid happened in Sydney, The people who could afford to moved out to the suburbs, which left the inner city, places like this, to those that couldn't afford to live anywhere else.
Who was the dominant figure around here?
The dominant figure in this area was definitely Tilly Devine.
By dominant figure, we really mean unscrupulous, vicious underworld crime boss. And you thought she was some sweet old lady. In the 1930s, everyone knew about Tilly. Apart from anything else, she was the owner of 30 brothels. But we're going to tell you a story that I'm betting you haven't heard. It happened in February 1945 at her house, which was a quick stagger down the street from the Tradesman's Arms. Handy, because Tilly liked to drink. Or 10. Hi, excuse us, how do you do?
Hi.
You live here?
Yes,
Did you know that Tilly Devine once lived here?
I did know that, yeah.
Would you mind if we come in, because we want to show people about that story?
Absolutely.
The current occupants don't know it yet, but they're going to help me recreate a memorable lovers' tiff which involved Tilly, her boyfriend, and a gun. Right, you are no longer Damien and Kate. Is this all right with you, by the way? Okay. You are Eric Parsons, who was Tilly's boyfriend. Right. And you are Tilly, OK? Eric, would you go upstairs to the bedroom?
Sure.
I bet you didn't expect to hear that from another bloke when you got up this morning. OK, so the copper bursts in. He was called...
Sergeant Gilmore.
OK, and he sees Tilly, and what did he say to her?
He says, Mrs. Devine, I believe that there has been a shooting at this address today.
And Tilly said...
I don't know anything about it.
Yes! You're absolutely correct. That's superb. And the copper then said, well, can I go upstairs and have a look?
Yes.
Thank you. You stay down there, Kate. We'll come back to you later on. Now the copper's racing towards the bedroom. He bursts in, and there is Eric, although not like that.
No, in fact, he was under the covers.
Oh, OK.
With his eyes closed.
Alrighty.
Pretending to be asleep.
Are you all right? Have you been shot?
No, I'm good.
Correct. So he sees the bloke there. He doesn't appear to have been shot, and the policeman leaves.
Indeed.
Correct?
Yes.
But then he changes his story, doesn't he?
Yes, he changes his story and confesses that...
Tilly did it.
Correct. Yes, Tilly. Tilly has to stand trial?
She has. The policeman, Sergeant Gilmore, arrests Tilly, charges her with attempted murder, and the trial is to be held in a couple of weeks' time.
But...
Eric has had second thoughts and refuses to testify against her. The whole case is thrown out.
Why do you think he did that?
I think he was either scared or he genuinely loved her.
So she is freed. That's great.
Yes.
And there's a happy ending to the story.
There is indeed. 3 months later, they were married.
History doesn't record whether or not it was a shotgun wedding, but we do know they lived happily ever after. Well, actually, 12 years later, Eric died, but you know what I mean. There can't be many countries in the world, can there, where you can just knock on someone's door and in about 5 seconds persuade them to do this massive reenactment of a shooting that took place there about 65 years previously. It's mad. It's brilliant, but it is mad. So we've been swimming without getting wet, ballooning without leaving the ground, and staging a home invasion without getting arrested. I told you it would be a different kind of walk. Look at this, look. I love it when you see a plinth just plonked down in the middle of a pavement. You know that either some kind of artwork was commissioned and it was never put up, or else it was put up and then it was pulled back down again. Just hang on. Excuse me. May I borrow you for 1 second? Is that all right? Would you come over here? You see this plinth? Would you mind getting up onto it for me? In the 1990s, a statue was commissioned of a woman called Joy. And the idea was that she represented all the street workers of Woolloomooloo. Please don't take it personally. And could you cross your legs? Because that's how she had crossed legs. And then she was smoking a cigarette That's it. That's exactly it. That's just like the photo of the statue. And she was up there for about 18 months, but then tragically her arms were hacked off by vandals. That's good. And her legs were hacked off as well. You don't have to do that. And then the council came away and took her down. So there's no joy here unless you want to stay up there. But I don't expect you to. Thank you ever so much. Bye. I'm still on Palmer Street. This is the beginning of the big freeway heading south. But right here, there's this funny little pretend field. And in it, there's a sheep and a cow and two big circular things that look a bit like dunnies. What on earth could this be? I will show you. It's wool, loo, moo, loo. Woolloomooloo. It's a joke. I'm right in the heart of Woolloomooloo here, and snaking through the whole area, you've got the Eastern Suburbs Railway up above us. And the thing that really interests me is that on each one of these concrete stands here, you've got a mural. This mural, for instance, has been here for over 40 years and it's hardly been defaced at all, which is quite a tribute. It tells a fascinating story. Can you see in the middle, you've got the Builders Labourers Federation marching in support of something called the Green Bands, and that's their leader there, a bloke called Jack Mundy. And up the top, you've got business leaders and politicians. And if those guys had had their way, then none of this would still be here. It's the early 1970s and developers wanted Woolloomooloo razed to the ground. But the BLF, or at least the New South Wales branch of the BLF, decided that its members would no longer work on these multi-million-dollar developments unless a lot of affordable housing was put in, unless local people were consulted, and unless beautiful old buildings like this one put up in 1853 were protected. And it works. Look at this fantastic area. Isn't it beautiful? And although the BLF was central to this campaign, it was local people who kick-started it. It is fair to say that the struggle to save all these houses wasn't entirely successful, was it?
No,
not 100%.
Not 100%, no. In fact, this is where it started. This was the first house that was pulled down about 1971.
So what we're seeing now is a rebuild?
A rebuild. There was a corner shop here, owned by, I forget who it was owned by, but it went, and this is where we all came down on the next day when they were attempting to pull it down more, and then there were the women, myself and others who were trying to stop the bulldozers from operating. We couldn't stop them, but that was the catalyst to start then of the Woolloomooloo Resident Action Group, yes.
And what was it that you actually wanted?
We wanted this area here for low-income families.
Yeah.
But you see, so close to the city, so close to everything else, they wanted it for other purposes. If you have a look around, all of this was saved.
None of this stuff would have been here.
Exactly right.
So I wouldn't be able to do this walk that I'm doing today, at least not in the Woolloomooloo that we can now see, if it hadn't been for Jim and all those people like him. Good on you, mate. See ya. Call me an ageing hippie lefty, and plenty of people have, but when the little guys take on the big guys and win, I do get a bit goosebumpy. My goosebumps and I are finishing our walk down by the water at one last Woolloomooloo icon. It's called Finger Wharf, and it's the largest timber pile wharf in the world. Loads and loads of wool passed in and out of here, and thousands of soldiers in 2 world wars. It was also the first glimpse generations of migrants had of their new Australian home. After 70 years of faithful service, the state government decided to demolish it in the 1980s. So once again, the unions and the people banded together. And this building was saved by the Green Bands, which is great. It's a lovely place.
What are you filming?
It's a history series. Ironically, now it's a bit of an enclave for the beautiful people. But all the fancy restaurants and waterside apartments do make it a buzzing, if somewhat pricey, part of the city. So before you know it, we've condensed nearly 200 years of history into a half-day walk. How good is that? The word Woolloomooloo is actually a corruption of an old Aboriginal word meaning desirable location. And OK, I know it's sometimes been thought of as Woolloomoolethal and Woolloomoolooed, but actually Woolloomooloo is still a very desirable location. Hi, I'm Tony Robinson. If you love my show and want to see some more amazing history stories, then please hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and we'll let you know when there's something new to watch. Enjoy.